Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the John Carter Brown Library. My name is Neil Saphir. I'm the library's director, as well as associate professor in the history department here at Brown. And let me say, first and foremost, how thrilled we are to welcome you to the library on the occasion of this evening's lecture by Christy Clark Pujara. It's a special privilege for us to be supporting the work of the Rhode Island chapter of the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project, a group with the expressed goal of acknowledging, confronting, commemorating, memorializing, and reflecting upon Rhode Island's history of slavery and the slave trade. Let me say, in no uncertain terms, that we fully support this group in their mission and are extremely proud to put the bibliographical and human resources of this institution toward their effort. When John Carter Brown began constructing a library of the American experience in its broadest geographical and historical vein, he never attempted to exclude materials related to slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, one of America's, and indeed the world's, darkest chapters. To the contrary, the mission of this institution has always been to collect everything related to the history of the Americas, the good, the bad, and the ugly. That remains our mission to this day, and we are proud to welcome every researcher who requires access to what we have preserved and protected now for generations on any subject where our collection can be seen to be relevant. Another aspect of the library's mission is reaching out to new communities. Over the course of its 170-year history, the JCB's neighbors and community members have all too rarely been invited in to understand why such an important resource for researchers around the globe sits here at this location on this campus. Our new strategic plan, which was recently ratified by the library's independent governing board, reflects a new orientation toward outreach. As we digitize our materials and become even better known to the world outside of Rhode Island, my personal hope is that we can increasingly use this space to bring in new constituencies and put them into contact with that history. Sponsoring 3 lectures on the slave trade in and to Rhode Island, alongside the Rhode Island Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project. Amazed that I was able to say that without stumbling over it. It's a mouthful. As well as the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice here at Brown, is a great example of collaboration, one that will result, we hope, in bringing more community members from throughout Rhode Island into this library. We here care for some of the world's most important books and maps for those who eventually found their way here, including Cape Verdean, Guatemalan, Mexican, Haitian, and other communities. But even more relevant for this project, books related to the history of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade are one of the most important parts of our collection, and it is an area that we are consciously growing. For this reason, we're pleased to bring attention to this history tonight by showcasing some of our materials related to the slave trade after the lecture and located over there beneath the vitrine. The account book of the slave ship Sally, for example, which is featured prominently on the MPC PMP's website, is part of our collection, and we share its history with deep respect for those who died during that tragic moment of the Middle Passage. Before I turn things over to Matt Riley, let me close with a personal note. Last year, I attended personally one of the early community meetings of the Rhode Island Middle Passage Commemoration and Port Markers Project at the Beneficent Church in downtown Providence. I've also followed its activities with great interest. Having this group join us here at the John Carter Brown Library is the first step, but an important step, in joining forces to commemorate history as it should and can be remembered. And with that, I turn the podium over to Matt, and I thank you for including the John Carter Brown Library as one more stop on the voyage to commemorate the Middle Passage and the slave trade here in Rhode Island.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. It's incredibly encouraging to see so many people here for this event. My name is Matt Riley, and I'm a visiting assistant professor here at Brown. Before introducing this evening's speaker, a few thank yous are in order. First of all, thank you so much to Neil Saphir and the John Carter Brown Library for making this event and this series possible. I'd like to thank Tara Kingsley here at the JCB for working on the logistics for this series, and I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors across campus and across the state, including the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, the History Department, the Swearer Center, and the University of Rhode Island. In particular, I'd like to thank Shanna Weinberg and Maya Gamble Rivers at the CSSJ for all of their hard work. This event is part of a series organized by the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project. The Rhode Island chapter of this national organization seeks to acknowledge, commemorate, and memorialize the lives of those who suffered the brutality of the Middle Passage, in addition to confronting the role that the slave trade played in local economics, politics, and society. The project is currently organizing events and ceremonies in addition to designing and planning the installation of port markers. But I should note that this is an ongoing effort that will hopefully have a lasting impact in our communities for years to come. This is a community-oriented project, and we encourage any interested community members to get involved. Please visit our website at rimiddlepassage.org for more information and to join our mailing list. Here you'll find more information on future events, including lectures associated with this series that is generously supported by the JCB. In the coming months, we'll be hosting Bob Geek and Loren Spears on March 16th, Sawande Mustaqim on April 27th, and Wendy Warren on May 12th. I should also point out that tomorrow evening, Dr. Clark Pujara will be heading to the University of Rhode Island to give a talk at 6 o'clock to mark the closing of an exhibition entitled Invisible Bodies, Disposable Cloth, Rhode Island and Slavery, 1783 to the 1850s. Please try to make it this exciting exhibition before it closes tomorrow evening. This evening, however, we're delighted to host our own event with Dr. Christy Clark Pujara. To introduce our speaker and the significance of her work, I'd like to begin with a short anecdote. Last month on Saturday, January 21st, along with millions of others in locations around the world, I took part in the Women's March here in Providence. Following a greeting and a commitment to resistance from Governor Gina Raimondo, the first gentleman, Andy Moffett, took to the podium. His impassioned words spoke to the values of Rhode Island, both past and present, and its resilient spirit in the face of injustice. In reference to the 17th century settlement and development of the colony, Moffett stated, and I'm paraphrasing here, that Rhode Island was built on religious freedom. It was built on tolerance. He quickly moved on, suggesting that the collective spirit of freedom and acceptance in the past would help to lead us to a brighter future. In thinking about the work of someone like Dr. Christy Clark Pujara, it's important that we recognize some of the significant omissions in the first gentleman's comments. Despite its reputation for tolerance and progressivism, Rhode Island and Providence plantations, like countless other places throughout the Atlantic world, was also built on the exploitation and enslavement of brown and black bodies. Indigenous and African slavery were part of the social fabric of colonial New England, and Rhode Island was no exception. As our speaker has demonstrated in her work, slavery was big business, and it touched the lives of all Rhode Islanders, enslaved and free. As Dr. Clark Pujara also points out, this is not just a story about the past. Rather, we as residents of Rhode Island experience the legacies of this history in the form of persistent racial inequity, but we also experience it on the built landscape, on the waterways that meander through the state, on the streets named after former slave ship captains and slave trade merchants, and even in the buildings where we gather for events. These histories demand our attention because they weigh on our present and shape our future. As Dr. Clark Pujara poignantly remarks in her new book, quote, without a full accounting of the role that free and enslaved black people played and the centrality of the business of slavery in the founding, maintenance, and economic ascent of the United States, objections to righting the wrongs of the nation's past will continue, end quote. Dr. Clark Pujara's work is a crucial step in this important process of accounting for, acknowledging, and confronting this dark work and these dark legacies. Dr. Christy Clark Pujara is an associate professor of Afro-American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She received her bachelor's from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, before making her way to the University of Iowa, where she received her PhD in 2009. Her dissertation explores the lives of enslaved and free black residents of Rhode Island, examining their roles in the social, economic, and political development of the colony and state. While providing stark insight into the economic significance of the business of slavery, her work never loses sight of the human side of the experiences of enslavement, racial discrimination, and unrelenting perseverance for Black Rhode Islanders. Her work has appeared in several local publications, including New England Ancestors Magazine and Rhode Island History. She's also passionate about the development of effective strategies for incorporating these dark histories into classrooms across the country. While her current research investigates race relations and the lives of Black settlers in Wisconsin, she's here today to speak about her wonderful new book, Dark Work, The Business of Slavery in Rhode Island, published by NYU Press just a few months ago in 2016. I have my copy right here, and we have copies for sale in the back of the room right after the event that Dr. Clark-Pujara will be happy to sign during and after the reception. For now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Christy Clark-Pujara.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming out. I just want to very briefly thank a few people. I want to thank Matthew Riley for contacting me and arranging this entire talk. I appreciate that, as well as, sorry, I don't want to say your name wrong. Safir, and Tara Kingsley for opening up this space and making all the arrangements to get me from Madison to here. I want to thank everybody at John Carter Brown Library and at Brown University for supporting this series. I also want to thank Shauna Weinberg and Maya Gamble Rivers at the Center for the Study of Justice, Slavery and Justice for welcoming me here, as well as the Middle Passages, Ceremonies, and Port Markers Project. This is one of those moments that I'm never going to forget. The first time I walked into the John Carter Brown Library, I was a graduate student in 2006, and I had my letter of introduction that said I could indeed research in this space. My luggage had been lost on my way from Iowa City to here, and I was wearing sweats that I had been in for 2 days, and I walked into this majesty of a room and never felt more out of place. And if you had told me then that I would be invited back now to a room full of people who care enough to spend their evening hearing about my research, I would have laughed in your face. So this is just one of those moments. So Dark Work, The Business of Slavery. This book is a labor of love and represents over a decade of my life. I began this project as a dissertation after I read Gradual Emancipation, Disowning Slavery by Joanne Pope Malish in grad school, and it changed my life. I wanted to know everything I could about Northern slavery, and I began reading everything I could, going back to Lorenzo Green and Edgar McManus and what they had written decades and decades before. And I began to think, well, where's the book about Rhode Island? Because some things just keep coming up. How was 10% of the population enslaved by the middle of the 18th century? Why did they dominate the North American trade in slaves? They're the size of a county. And then I started looking for the book on Rhode Island, and I couldn't find it. And I got really excited because as a grad student, that's exactly what you want. You want there to be a gap in the literature. That moment translated into many years and summers of research, including in this space right here. Just want a quick note on language. When you hear me say words like Negro, I am quoting directly from sources. If it's a long quote, I will let you know that I'm quoting. If not, I'll just say it. I also want to give you a definition about what I mean when I say the business of slavery. I define the business of slavery as all economic activity that was directly related to the maintenance of slaveholding in the Americas, specifically the buying and selling of people, food, and goods. Historians have written expansively about the slave economy and its vital role in early American economic life. My research focuses on how the business of slavery shaped the experiences of the enslaved, stalled the emancipation process, and circumscribed Black freedom in New England and in Rhode Island in particular. Why Rhode Island? Rhode Island is the best place to study the impact of the business of slavery because it's both exemplary and exceptional. Like their northern neighbors, Rhode Islanders bought and sold people and supplies that kept the plantations in the Americas thriving. However, Rhode Islanders were among the most deeply invested. Rhode Islanders supplied European colonists in the West Indies with slaves, livestock, dairy products, fish, candles, and lumber. In return, they received molasses, which they distilled into rum. This trade began in the late 17th century and flourished in the 18th century as rum becomes a currency. It was the West Indian trade that propelled Newport out of Boston's shadow and into the status of a major city and helped establish Providence as a major port. This trade also supplied Rhode Islanders with their #1 export, rum. So the Sugar Islands were so profitable that it made more sense to use most of their arable land for sugar cultivation and to import all their food. So New England farmers are growing food for slaves in the West Indies. The candles that they're using to light their homes and their sugar mills come from New England. The Narragansett pacer was a favorite livestock of those in the West Indies because it was short and stocky and had an even gait. And so plantations don't exist on their own. They're supplied, and they were supplied by colonists in New England. Prior to 1696, the English Royal Company had a monopoly on all English participation in the Atlantic slave trade. New Englanders began sending slave ships as soon as the monopoly was lifted. The voyages grew increasingly common and profitable, and in fewer than 30 years, Rhode Islanders dominated the North American trade in African slaves. The slave trade evolved into one of the main pillars of the local economy. The vast majority of the slave ships that embarked from British North America left from ports in Newport and Providence, even though it was the smallest and least populated colony. During the colonial period in total, Rhode Islanders sent some 514 slave ships to the coast of West Africa, while the rest of the colonists combined sent 189. After the Revolution, Bristol became the primary slave trading port. In 20 years, between 1787 and 1807, Rhode Islanders transported an estimated 45,230 Africans to bondage. That was only 10,000 fewer than had been transported in the previous 70 years. As historian Jay Cottrey has argued, the North American trade in slaves was essentially the Rhode Island slave trade. So the slave trade is usually where the focus is because it was so notorious to this region. But the slave trade was just one of those pillars. I always remind people of the importance of this West Indian trade, this bilateral trade, feeding and supplying the slave populations in the West Indies. Not to mention, they get the byproduct for their #1 export. You need the molasses to distill the rum. Right? The third pillar, made in part from cotton picked by enslaved people, Negro cloth, also known as kertzie, was a cheap, coarse, blended cotton wool material manufactured especially to reduce the cost of clothing enslaved African Americans in the South. Between 1800 and 1860, more than 80 Negro cloth mills opened in Rhode Island. And by 1850, 79% of all Rhode Island textile mills manufactured slave clothing. So while all New Englanders were manufacturing Negro cloth, Rhode Islanders were almost solely dedicated to its production. They were doubly dependent on the business of slavery. because Negro cloth was made in part from cotton that was picked by slaves and then manufactured and sold to planters for enslaved people to wear. Also, the common Kentucky jean, the dominant cloth type that was made in South County, was selected by Levi Strauss to make mining pants, the precursor of the modern jean, which I'm sure everybody in this room owns. What is now just ubiquitous American and Western wear began its life as slave clothing. This is a history that lives with us. And so whether we're talking about the colonial period or the post-colonial period, the business of slavery was central to the economy in Rhode Island. I just want to give you a sense of population of numbers. Is this cut off, or can you see it? Okay. So in the North as a whole, and you can see the percentage of people of African descent who were assumed to be enslaved. It was about 5%. Rhode Island is double that at 10, much more than its New England neighbors at 2 and 3%. But even within Rhode Island, the slave population was heavily concentrated in places like Newport and the Narragansett, where every fourth person you met would be a person who was property. Just also wanted to give you a sense of the free black population in the post-revolutionary period and how fast it grew. It's frustrating to go from the numbers that we have for the middle of the 18th century to the end of the 18th century. In that revolutionary period, we have some good guesstimations, but not the same kind of numbers we have in the post-revolutionary period because of the census. So I just want to give you a sense of how many people we're talking about and the percentages of the population. As you can see, the vast majority of black people in the North are free by the first decade of the 19th century. In 1652, colonial officials in Providence and Warwick banned the enslavement of black and white mankind. 24 years later, in 1676, they prohibited the enslavement of American Indians. Nevertheless, in 1703, the Rhode Island General Assembly legally recognized both black and American Indian slavery. And by 1750, Rhode Islanders held the highest percentage of slaves in New England. This about-face reflected Rhode Islanders' increased participation in the Atlantic economy. Before they committed themselves to the pursuit of commerce in multiple directions across the Atlantic Ocean, Rhode Islanders sought to restrict and even ban slaveholding. However, once they began to participate in the West Indian and Atlantic slave trades, they wrote race-based slavery into law. By the 1730s, merchants, slave traders, farmers, distillers, and tradesmen had created a niche for themselves in the Atlantic economy, and a series of racist laws followed. Moreover, the more entrenched Rhode Islanders became in the business of slavery, the more they relied on slave labor. An interesting result of Rhode Island's particular economy is that it dictated the geographic patterns of slaveholding in the colony as well as the work done by enslaved people. We know that enslaved people throughout the North did not produce a staple crop. Instead, their labor helped to sustain the multitude of slaves that cultivated sugar, tobacco, and rice elsewhere in the Americas. Nowhere was this connection more salient than in Rhode Island. Enslaved Rhode Islanders labored in distilleries where rum was made to purchase slaves. They built slave ships that transported enslaved Africans. They served as crew on those ships as they crisscrossed the Atlantic and grew the food that sustained the enslaved. Just as the growth of the plantation transformed black life in the South, the growth of the business of slavery transformed black life in the North, and in Rhode Island in particular. Prior to white Rhode Islanders' commitment to Atlantic commerce in the first decades of the 18th century, the enslaved population was relatively small, scattered, and predominantly American Indian. However, as the West Indian and Atlantic slave trades became the cornerstones of the local economy, more and more enslaved people of African descent were brought into the colony. Those larger webs of trading determined the places where enslaved people lived and dictated the work they performed. Most rural slaves lived on large farms with 3 or 4 other enslaved people of African or American Indian descent, or white and native indentured servants. In the countryside, these bound people labored as cow herders, as shepherds, as dairy farmers, fishermen, and cultivated small amounts of grains and vegetables. Most urban slaves worked alongside their masters, alongside their enslavers, or just with one other enslaved or indentured person. In the coastal cities of Newport, Providence, and Warwick, and Bristol, bound people worked as domestics, tradesmen, shopkeepers, and general laborers. The cumulative labor of these enslaved men, women, and children all across the colony undergirded the buying and selling of people and goods on the other side of the Atlantic. The enslaved, however, refused to be treated as chattel. While few sources reveal the day-to-day experiences of the enslaved, combing public records, private documents allows for reasonable reconstruction of their lives. Census data, court records, correspondence, private papers, and estate business records of slaveholders shed light on the activities of the enslaved, while also highlighting the challenges they encountered as inheritable and contested property. The agency of many of the enslaved countered attempts by enslavers to view and treat them as commodities, even when those enslavers were commodity traders. White merchants and slave traders who carried out the business of slavery in colonial Rhode Island were not just businessmen, but active participants in the development and maintenance of American slavery, a system that attempted unsuccessfully to dehumanize people of African descent. Many enslaved Rhode Islanders took advantage of the fact that their labor often mirrored that of whites. They assisted their enslavers in their various businesses and were routinely rented out as tradesmen and sailors, positions that afforded them increased opportunity to challenge the institution. Yet most enslaved Rhode Islanders who resisted slavery were not attacking the business of slavery, but seeking freedom for themselves, their families, and their communities. Their resistance and lived experiences are critical to understanding how modern American slavery was contested from every angle. Whether enslaved people found themselves laboring on vast plantations, small and large farms, in the city, on ships, or in shops, they ran away, they lobbied for their freedom, and strived to build full lives within the confines of slavery. Enslaved Rhode Islanders, like their counterparts throughout the Americas, refused to be simple property. In 1673, Negro slaves Maria and George were indicted for fornicating. They both were found guilty and sentenced to 15 stripes. In 1707, an unnamed Negro man reportedly murdered his master, ran away, and drowned himself rather than be captured by officials. The General Assembly ordered, and I quote, that his head, legs, and arms be cut from his body and hung in some public place near the town of Newport to public view, and his body be burnt to ashes, that it may, if it please God, be something of a terror to others from perpetuating of the like barbarity in the future, end quote. In 1728, Jethro, an enslaved Negro, stole a canoe from his master, Robert Wilcox, a yeoman of Kingston, and paddled to Martha's Vineyard and hid among the Indians. In 1734, Hezekiah Gorton's Negro man was found guilty of poisoning 2 white women, Anne Markham and Rebecca French, with the contaminated apples and milk, and was ordered, and I quote, tied or bound to the public whipping post in said town and stripped naked from his waist upwards, receiving 25 lashes on his naked body, end quote. In 1731, Thomas Randall's Negro boy, tired of tending animals, confessed to setting the barn afire. Maria and George acted outside the control of their masters when they had sex. They were willing to risk severe punishment for their relationship. Both the unnamed Negro man and Jethro robbed their enslavers of their human property. The poisoner embarrassed his enslaver by poisoning his guest. Moreover, he could have killed them. The boy destroyed the shelter for the livestock, which were prized possessions. These individual acts of resistance were as varied in motivation as they were in execution. Some were in search of autonomous relationships. Others may have sought revenge or found themselves caught in a moment of anger that led them to kill or plan to kill or cause illness. Some were seeking temporary or permanent escape from slavery. And although these acts of resistance were not aimed at destroying the business of slavery, their actions did disrupt the business of their enslavers. Enslaved Rhode Islanders also transformed local rivers and waterways from avenues of economic opportunity for the enslaver class to avenues of escape. Flight via water was such a concern that in 1714, the General Assembly forbade enslaved people from boarding ferries alone, even under the directive of their enslavers. They had to be accompanied by their owner or some white person in authority. They also interrupted the business of slavery by stowing away on ships, which were plentiful in the port cities of Newport, Providence, and Bristol. It was in response to this that the General Assembly passed the 1757 law, allowing slaveholders to search private vessels where they suspected their human property was stowed, entitled them to double damages if a privateer or captain was found guilty of stealing another inhabitant slave, and made captains responsible for ensuring that no slaves were hidden on their vessels. These laws reveal the determination and resourcefulness of enslaved people who refused to accept their legal status as chattel. Enslaved Rhode Islanders, like their counterparts throughout the Americas, also resisted the institution of slavery through recreation. They took time for themselves. Despite their many burdens, enslaved people found pleasure in and uses for their bodies that were independent of and not beneficial to their enslavers. Caesar London, the enslaved business agent of Rhode Island Governor Josiah London, recorded the contents of a rather elaborate cookout held by several enslaved people. On August 12, 1766, several enslaved men and women, including one couple, left Newport and went to Portsmouth for a day in the country. They took, and I quote, "a pig to roast, wine, bread, rum, green corn, limes for punch, sugar, butter, tea, and coffee." Yes, they legally belonged to someone, but they also demanded time for themselves. Enslavers understood that slave management included concessions to enslaved people. The enslaved also attempted to institutionalize leisure and recreation. Starting as early as the late 17th century, enslaved communities in the North began to gather annually to feast, dance, play games, drink, gamble, and sometimes elect an honorary governor or king to rule for the duration of the festivities. For a day or two, enslaved people gathered to reconnect, to rejuvenate. These festivals, which typically took place in the spring, were known as Negro Election Days throughout New England and Pinkster Days elsewhere in the Northeast. So while the business of slavery created the framework of the lives of the enslaved, it did not control their lives. These were people with various different personalities, and they knew their masters well, and they found ways to try and live full lives within the institution of slavery. So while slavery oppressed them, it did not destroy them. The American Revolution was instrumental in the destruction of slaveholding in the North and in Rhode Island. However, investments in the business of slavery expand in the post-revolutionary period. When the British passed the American Revenue Act of 1764, an attempt to restrict trade with the French-ruled West Indian islands, Rhode Island merchants were greatly alarmed. They considered the act, and I quote, highly injurious and detrimental to all His Majesty's North American colonies in general, and to this colony in particular, end quote. Because most of the West Indian trade was with non-British colonies. The governor and other colonial officials offered many arguments against renewing the act, to no avail. During the American Revolution, Rhode Island's economy ground to a near halt as the British blockades effectively shut down the ports. No slave ships sailed, rum distilleries sat idle, the Narragansett farmers had no way to ship out their slave-produced goods. By the end of the war, the newly formed state was nearly bankrupt. After the war, Rhode Islanders returned to what they knew best, the business of slavery. Local merchants had been the last New Englanders to stop slave trading before the outbreak of war in 1776, and they were the first to begin slave trading after the peace in 1783. The actions taken by African Americans during and following the Revolutionary War were essential to the breakdown of slaveholding in the North. Enslaved Northerners ran away in unprecedented numbers, volunteered for military service, sued for, bargained for, and bought their freedom. Between 1773 and 1800, 129 runaway ads were placed in Rhode Island. Nearly twice as many enslaved Rhode Islanders ran away in the Revolutionary and post-Revolutionary period as in the half-century preceding it. Notably, all 5 of the enslaved people in John Brown's household absconded during the Revolutionary period. They settled in Boston. On February 4th, 1778, the Rhode Island General Assembly declared, and I quote, that every able-bodied Negro, mulatto, or Indian man slave in this state may enlist in either of the said 2 battalions to serve during the continuance of this present war with Great Britain. Enslaved Rhode Islanders immediately took advantage of the opportunity to enlist in return for their freedom. Well over 200 former slaves served in the Rhode Island First, a nearly all-black regiment. Unlike many of their counterparts, Black Rhode Island soldiers served as foot soldiers rather than servants, cooks, manual laborers, or foragers. The Rhode Island First fought for nearly 5 years in Rhode Island, New Jersey, and New York. They were one of the few units that enlisted for the duration of the war. At the close of the war, the weary soldiers of the Rhode Island First walked home. Some were ill, most were poor, as they were paid in depreciated continental currency. Moreover, these were veterans of the American Revolution who were not recognized as citizens in the new nation. I'm going to talk a little bit about gradual emancipation laws. The one I know best is the one here in Rhode Island, and it read something like, the children born to enslaved mothers after March 1st of 1784 will not be enslaved but indentured to their mother's master until they come of majority. And so the North formally weans itself off of slavery. And it leads to this protracted, uneven process of the breakdown of slavery in the northern states. But something I want to draw your attention to, which was written about by, I am blanking on his name and it's driving me crazy now. He wrote More Than Tears. John Wood Sweet. Anyway, you guys don't need to know that detail. That's the academic in me. If you notice the first dates of emancipation because of the gradual emancipation laws, and then you notice when most people are free, it becomes pretty clear that most people are free before the gradual emancipation laws. So the gradual emancipation laws are a reflection of what was happening, right? They're not the catalyst for. Okay. The denial of citizenship did not mean a lack of progress. The actions of the enslaved, running away, joining the military, lobbying for their freedom, in conjunction with an emerging abolition movement, had torn at the fabric of slavery and challenged the morality and legitimacy of slaveholding in the new democracy. Moreover, in the northern states, slave labor, though important, was not at the center of the economy in the way it was in the cash crop dependent economies of the South that relied wholly on slave labor. Consequently, most northern states passed gradual emancipation laws during and following the American Revolution. So these laws are monumental, but it's important to remember that it's the actions of enslaved people that actually lead to the breakdown of slavery in places like Rhode Island. So you have people who are born before the gradual emancipation law who are slaves for life. You have people who are born after the gradual emancipation law that are statutory slaves, so they're servants well into their 20s. And you have families where some people had successfully run away and changed their identity, and you have people who had served in the military, and you had people who had made deals with their masters. I will be a good and faithful servant for 10 years, but you must free me in 10 years or I'll be troublesome. And you have some people that are manumitted by their masters who cannot reconcile slavery and freedom. And so you have this community that is made up of people of various different statuses. Some people are free, some people are going to be free, other people are fugitives, others have purchased themselves, others have been manumitted. How do you make something of that? From the last decade of the 18th century through the first 3 decades of the 19th century, Black Rhode Islanders struggled to build lives as free individuals. While the former enslaver class grappled with the loss of mastery and attempted to maintain economic and social control over the sons and daughters of their former masters. The attempts to control Black people were evident in discriminatory laws, the exclusion of Blacks from factory work, and the destruction of Black neighborhoods and racially motivated riots. Moreover, Black emancipation was at odds with the expanding business of slavery. The growth of the Atlantic trade and the entry of slave trade and entry into the textile industry, which was dependent on slave-grown cotton. Interracial marriages were banned in Rhode Island in 1789, and African American men were barred from voting in 1822. The ban on interracial marriages reflected the desire of public officials to prevent racial mixing, at least mixing that was not forced by a white master. Black disenfranchisement was most likely triggered by an increasing number of Black property holders. On October 1824, white Rhode Islanders destroyed nearly all the homes in the predominantly African American neighborhood of Hardscrabble. 7 years later, white Rhode Islanders rioters wreaked havoc for 4 days in Snowtown, another predominantly Black community. It was the first time the state militia had to be called out to put down a public disturbance. Both riots occurred in Providence, where many of the state's African Americans lived, and began when Blacks refused to show public deference to whites, like moving off the sidewalk when they were walking down it. Both riots culminated in the destruction of Black property. The white residents of Providence, like whites throughout the North, were uncomfortable with and resentful of an ever-increasing population of free and increasingly independent Black people. Economic discrimination was also abundant. In fact, most free people of color found themselves performing the same work they had done as slaves. Most Black men labored as day laborers or sailors, while African American women worked as domestics. The exception would be these skilled tradesmen who found in freedom they couldn't find work that they had done as enslaved men. Free Black people were shut out of factory work. These attacks on recently freed people suggest more than economic and social discrimination. Black independence in any form was a threat to the state's economy because Black independence called the institution of slavery into question, a business that it supported. So free Black people are an ideological problem. So while Black people could be free, they could not be equal. Many white Rhode Islanders feared a Black population who, at least in theory, were free to work and move as they pleased. Free Blacks had to contend with a white citizenry that did not view them as citizens or legitimate residents of the new nation. So although some white Northerners had committed to ending slavery in their own region, free people of color were to remain on the margins of society. As individuals, Black Rhode Islanders could affect little change. However, as a community, they could and did address the racism that relegated them to the margins. In the colonial period, the business of slavery served to enslave Black people. In the post-colonial period, the business of slavery served to impoverish, alienate, and disenfranchise Black people. In response, like their counterparts throughout the northern states, Black Rhode Islanders came together to build institutions and fight for their rights as free people. They established mutual aid societies, the Free African Union Society in 1780, the African Benevolent Society in 1807, the Female African Benevolent Society in 1809, the African Union Meeting House in 1819. Mutual aid societies were of special value to developing communities because they help create and institutionalize different roles, relationships, values, and ways of living outside the institution of slavery. The birth of Black institutions throughout the North demonstrated the desires of Black people to direct their own future. Black Rhode Islanders not only built their own institutions, they attached themselves to state and national institutions in their pursuit of inclusion and equality. During the Dorr Rebellion, they offered their services to the state in hopes of regaining and expanding access to the ballot box. Their calculated gamble paid off. The 1842 Constitution extended the vote to all native-born men, Black and white. Moreover, the new state constitution abolished slavery. And after a nearly 10-year campaign, in 1866, Black Rhode Islanders claimed access to one of the most visible public institutions, public schools. Like the long, protracted fight for freedom from slavery, the battle for integrating public schools in Rhode Island was fraught with setbacks, disappointments, and intergroup conflict. Yet Black Rhode Islanders continued to struggle to create a space for themselves in the American Republic. Amidst their struggle to desegregate schools in 1863, Black Rhode Islanders took up arms to literally fight for the rights of Black people outside the state of Rhode Island. They risked their lives for the freedom of enslaved African Americans in the South. The Rhode Island 14th Regiment was the first Black heavy artillery regiment in the North. The regiment eventually grew to 12 companies, composing 3 battalions. The first company was almost entirely composed of Rhode Islanders. Black Rhode Islanders understood that their quest for citizenship was tied to their ability to become part of the state and national institutions, even when they were not welcomed or invited to join, just as they understood they needed their own institutions to uplift and care for their community. The erasure or marginalization of the Black experience and the centrality of the business of slavery to the Northern economy allows for a very dangerous fiction, that the North has no history of racism to overcome. And how do we learn who matters in history? Because when we get right down to it, that's why history is so important. History makes us human. History gives us a collective immortality. It legitimizes our culture. It tells us why we're important. It tells us who's contributing. And most people encounter history in public history settings and plaques that say, this great person did these great things. If all of those people are only male and only white most of the time, we're sent a very clear message about who matters, and more than that, who's human. We have to tell the history of African Americans and Africans in this space, because any story without them is disingenuous. We're missing something. The history of slavery in America is American history. It's not an aside. It's not an addendum to. It shouldn't be regulated to special classes or a month out of the year. It's central to the story of who we are. And that matters whether your family came here on the Mayflower or came here yesterday. People of African descent helped build this nation, North and South, made it a place that people wanted to be. And their history has to be central to that. And I want to applaud the Rhode Island Middle Passages and Port Makers Project for doing this essential work to re-educate the public. And thank you for having me. And I'm willing to ask a few questions. I caught a couple of typos on this. My 5-year-old was sitting on my lap last night as I was reviewing these, and she put in a question mark, but anyway. Into questions. Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much for this presentation, and what a great narrative in the book. I'm a real fan of historical narrative. My name is Bob Keith. I wrote a book on the first Rhode Island regiment. And my question is, I'm working on another project now about American plantations and the times that Rhode Island especially, the families had in Barbados and family members there. And my question is, do you feel that that also contributed to the extension of slavery, especially for Rhode Island in the West Indies and Caribbean?
So are you asking if the expansion of the plantation economy in the West Indies is related to Rhode Island?
No, I know it's related to
Yeah.
Rhode Island, but the family ties that Rhode Island established in those places, do you think that was also part of the reason that extended for such a long period of time?
Yes, because these merchants were global. You know, they would own land sometimes in the American South, sometimes in Cuba, sometimes in Barbados, and they would also have insurance companies that were insuring slave ships. These were people who were business moguls. They had their hands in various different pots, just like many Rhode Island governors were slave traders themselves. And I think it's important for people to understand that the history of Rhode Island isn't just New England history, it's American history, it's global history. Their connections in the West, in West Africa, to their connections throughout the Americas and back, that this is a part of a larger global history, that we need to start thinking bigger. I wrote an intensely local history, but it's a part of a much larger global history, absolutely. Yes?
In your research, have you come across the little town of Warren, Rhode Island? And if
Yes.
you have, what have you found?
I'm trying to think about specifically. I haven't read my book in a while. I think the last time I read it is before it got sent to press. What I can speak about is slavery in small towns in Rhode Island. And so, like I mentioned before, in the Narragansett, you have these rather large farms where there's 3 or 4 enslaved or unfree people in a household. In smaller towns, you often have slavery that I can only describe as being really lonely. If you're the only person in a household, right? And you're under constant surveillance. You get to see every day how different your life is that from those who own you. Not being able to live with your family, because there's patterns of slave ownership throughout the North and in Rhode Island in urban areas are 1 or 2 slaves. So that means you live away from the person that you love, or you live away from your brother, your sister, your mother, your father, and can only see them when you can make arrangements with your master to see them and their master allows it at the same time. And so often when I was looking at when I was looking at colonial census records and who was in households, it made me think of the loneliness of that. Because it's not as if they have their own room or anything. You're sleeping in a doorway, in an attic, in a garret. And what it must have been like to be one of two people who's captive in the household. Right? A lonely existence, right? Which makes these annual festivals really important. So you can see the community, so you can see your family. Yes.
Thank you for clarifying the role of the cotton mill cloth with the Negro trade, because somehow that little detail often is not mentioned in discussions of. But on your statistical gathering, when you say 79% of the mills were involved in the production of Negro cloth, is that meaning that was among the products they made, or that was substantially what the mill was dedicated to?
That was substantially what the mills were dedicated to. What's really incredible about the Negro cloth mills and the records is how good the records are. Many of them are actually at the Harvard Baker Business Library because they have a textile collection. And so you not only get business records, because these were family businesses, you get the letters between family members. About like what plantation they stay at in the South on a regular basis, who they're talking to drum up business, what kind of planters are considered their friends, what kind of planters that they don't like. And so you get a lot of information that's outside of just the sheer numbers.
Thank you. What's fascinating is Negro cloth is distinctly different from the other cloths, which I suspect was quite deliberate, and I just wondered what impacted the design of the cloth that was being made, other than the fact that it was lower cost.
That is actually something I didn't get into, but I get the sense that Rhode Islanders, again, for themselves, found a niche in Negro cloth, and that they already had connections with plantation owners and those who knew plantation owners in other places because they had for generations been in business with large slaveholders. Yes.
I'm looking forward to reading your book, so this question may be answered in it. But I've been looking in my own research for to what extent West African culture survived and was part of the Black experience in Rhode Island, and particularly thinking about, for example, funerals and how much was Negro election really a West African infused experience rather than, as it's often described, as kind of a parody of what white people were doing. And I wondered if you have any comments from what you've seen about the survival of African culture.
We can see the survival of African culture in people's names. So you'll have people who are named after days of the week, which is distinctly West African, and naming their children after the day of the week in which they were born. So, I mean, that's a way in which you definitely see retention. And as far as the Negro elections, I mean, you know, most historians are saying it's a combination of the two. So we've been having these kind of safety valve festivals throughout Europe for peasants. It's the upside down day. The people who are at the bottom get to be on the top. And that's what's happening in New England and throughout the North. And yes, it is, but African people also appropriate those festivities. And when you read about these strange and wild dances that they were doing, that people thought were, that the enslaver class thinks are very strange, it speaks to retention. One of my great frustrations is most of my sources, I have to read them backwards. You know, so they're not leaving me diaries and a bunch of letters. There's a few here and there, but trying to reconstruct their lives from what other people had to say about them or what they did, but the alternative to that is silence, and that's unacceptable. So I wish I did have more, and I think that there's a lot more to do. I think that I scratched the surface of history of African Americans in Rhode Island. If there's anybody who is interested in dissertation topics, I have several, because there are many questions that are unanswered. There is an opportunity to do some family genealogical research from the 18th century to the 19th century that I didn't do, that were really outside of the purview of my project. So there is a lot more work to be done. And I think especially in Black churches in the 19th century in Rhode Island, I'm stopping in that era, but there is a wealth of research out there, a wealth of knowledge. So there is a whole lot more to be done, and I look forward to it. Yes.
Thank you for speaking to us. I have a question about memorialization. At the end of your book, you say that the Iron Tree Memorial should be grounds for not only commemoration of slavery, and your book kind of ends with a call for more memorialization and more recognition of this history. But one of the things I wanted to ask, and kind of related to your talk, is the idea of the reasonable reconstruction of their lives, which I took to mean when you don't have tangible, irrefutable evidence, being able to construct something that can't exactly be proven or through oral histories and things like that. So my question is, how does that relate to ideas of women's history or histories of rape and trauma, which is something that I found somewhat absent in your book. You mentioned it a few moments. I remember in the riots you mentioned that rape and castration was something that happened, but it's not something that you delve into very much. So I'm just wondering, on one, how do you delve into those histories when there isn't a tangible trail to follow there? And the second is, well, then how do you then memorialize it? And by way of example, I've been thinking a lot about Dr. James Marion Sims, who's often called the father of gynecology, who famously or infamously tested his services on African slaves and on slave women. And Bettina Judd, who's a poet, and she memorialized it in her poetry, which she says, Sims invents the speculum, I invent the fancy. So my idea is, how do you memorialize that history of trauma that the traces aren't exactly easy to find?
So first I'll answer your question on, this question of reconstruction, and I'm going to give you two people that I think have done it very well. Wendy Warren's A Cause of Her Grief. She writes about a traveler who mentions hearing about witnessing the rape of an enslaved Black woman in a household in Massachusetts. And she attempts to reconstruct her life from a line. She goes back and looks at census records. Okay, who was in that household? Can we get a sense of maybe how old she was, who raped her, and why? And more than that, what does her rape tell us about the experiences of enslaved women in households? So it's called The Cause of Her Grief, Wendy Warren. Also, Sowande Muscatine, who's going to be here in a couple of months, wrote a great article about an enslaved woman who was murdered aboard a slave ship by James DeWolf. And she shall and must go overboard, Sowande Muscatine. So in my opinion, these are two people who do that really well. I was actually trained by a women's historian, and I was on the lookout for stories about women, for details and crumbs of their lives. And whenever I found it, I tried to include it. I didn't find those sources. That's not to say they're not there. They just weren't there in my survey, in my look. And so I try to think about what their experiences may have been like. If I had a diary entry or a journal entry somewhere where somebody had mentioned, the sexual abuse of a slave, I think I would have tried to do something with it. I just didn't come across it. As far as memorial, you mentioned the Brown Memorial, which I saw for the first time in person today because I was here in 2014, but it wasn't up yet. those kinds of memorials educate the public on the place of slavery in American history. And in a place like Rhode Island, where slavery was the center of the economy, the business of slavery was the center of the economy. I will argue with anybody on any day that the business of slavery was the center of this place. So, as many memorials as there are about religious tolerance and freedom and great empire builders and wonderful businessmen, there needs to be just as many memorials about enslaved people and the business of slavery. You shouldn't be able to go on any tour in Rhode Island about history and not hear about slavery. That should be an absurdity. And instead, it's not. Because most people aren't going to pick up this book. They don't go to lectures like this. They're not attending colleges and taking a course in Africana studies. They're walking the streets. And that's where we need to meet people. Because history tells us who matters, who's worthy, who's contributing, who belongs. Right? Yes?
Does anyone here heard about Carolyn Hazard, whose grandmother started the wool mill in Peacedale?
Yes, in her education efforts in the 19th century. Yes, in her education efforts in the 19th century.
And what she did, what kept quiet, because people kept work for the Negro quiet in those days. What she did in Albany, Georgia, where W.E.B. Du Bois studied the slavery situation, how she and her brothers before her supported.
Yes, I am aware of Catherine Hazard, but she's just outside of the, Carolyn Hazard, sorry. She's just outside of the purview of my project.
Well, and I think many people in this room might be happy to know that studies going on with Caroline Hazard, because she kept quiet, because in those days she had to. And her work in Albany, Georgia was taken on by some of slaves, and his work developed into the University of Georgia.
Okay.
Dr. King was very active in Albany, Georgia, and it was from there that the whole SNCC activity went on, the March to Selma.
Okay, I understand all of that, but that's just outside of the purview of this talk and my work.
Outside of the purview of this audience, I'm tired of the Rhode Island families being given no credit for some amelioration.
I think that's outside the purview of my talk, which is about the business of slavery from the colonial period through the post-colonial period. And I think it's I want to make something crystal clear. Talking about the history and experiences of African American people is not denigrating white people. To suggest that Black history should be quiet because it makes white people uncomfortable is the height of racism. Their experiences matter in the same way that the experiences of the Hazards matter. It isn't one or the other. We don't just have to tell one story, we tell all stories so we get a fuller picture. Me telling the history of slavery in this place is not denigrating this place, it's explaining this place. It's not one or the other. Black history does not have to suffer because it makes some people uncomfortable. To tell a people that their history doesn't need to be told is an incredible violence. Volumes and volumes have been dedicated to the history of white people in Rhode Island, and that is good and fine. But my work is about the history of Black people in Rhode Island, and that too is good and fine. Yes.
You mentioned at the end of your speech that African Americans had a great part in forming this country. Do you have any idea why we are not included in school books? Because if our history is set side by side with, as you said, and that lady over there said, the white history, Black lives will matter. And I'm not trying to bring politics into this at all.
But history is political, and we're fooling ourselves if we say it's not. Because history tells us who matters. who contributed, whose stories we need to tell. You know, I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, in the heart of the Midwest, yet we all dressed up like Puritans. Why? Because that was part of America's story. None of the white kids in my class who were descendants of Germans and Swedes could trace themselves to New England. But we still wore those belt buckles and we still had that play because that was part of American history. To get back to your question, I think the reason why Black history and the histories of Native Americans for that matter, and the history of Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans hasn't been fully integrated into American history is because it interrupts the master narrative that we have set that is nice and neat. Instead of telling a full picture of who this country is, we have always been diverse. This isn't something new that we should have to try to figure out. This is who we've always been. And are there parts of it that are uncomfortable? Are there parts of it that are shameful? Yes. But there are also parts of it that are incredibly inspirational and triumphant, and we shortchange ourselves when we think that we can only tell a narrow, sweet little story, and that is the only way to create patriots. I think we're better than that.
Thank you so much to everyone for being here tonight. Please take a look at our website, rimiddlepassage.org, to find out more about our upcoming events. Oddly enough, Sawande Mustaqim, April 27th, and Wendy Warren, May 12th, so they'll both be here for this lecture series. And please, before departing, take a look at the display that we have here, and a reception to follow, so grab a glass of wine, and also take advantage of the books for sale in the back of the room that Dr. Clark Bouchard would be happy to sign.
Thanks again for having me.
Please, thank you.